Well, just this one and see how it goes. I don't think I've ever been accused of being a soft-spoken American, so hopefully I'll be loud enough for you guys to hear. I know there's a lot going on. Thanks for coming. It's great to see a full crowd. I want to spend this next half hour or so, and hopefully we have some time for questions, and certainly if anything I say does not make sense, you can yell out and ask me to clarify as well. But I want to talk about what I call data for the 99%. And how do we really get everyone in an organization using data? And how do we unlock the data curiosity throughout our organizations? And so my name's Ben Schein. I'm the Vice President of Data Curiosity and Innovation at DOMO. I did get to create my own title. So that's what I wanted it to be. And I think it's a lot of what I do. And I've been at DOMO about 5 months. And prior to that, I worked at Target Corporation, which is a $70 billion retailer in the U.S., if anyone's gone to a Target store in the U.S. So I'll sort of weave together some of that experience, as well as we sort of unpack some of this thinking around how do we change culture around data. So when I think about this, I think there's sort of this core dilemma that as BI and data professionals that we're all dealing with and that everyone feels. I think if you could think back in your mind through times when you felt like you just don't have the information you need to make a business decision, right? And that might be about, are you going to invest in new software if you're on the IT side? It might be when you were in high school. It might be what you're trying to do as a family. But it always feels a little bit like we just never have it, and it's always harder than we think. And I think this is the core dilemma, the core reason why we don't see people engaging with data is because this is how they've been experiencing data over the last years. And at the core, really it's that data is emotional, right? We think about data as this very black and white thing. The data is right or the data is wrong. And that's, in reality, there is so much emotion built up in our organizations around data, around how we used it. It's around broken promises, wasted investment, disappointing, as a practitioner, disappointing your partners, right? We often talk about that 99% and trying to do it. It's also incredibly painful if you're part of the 1% to continually not be able to get the people that you're trying to help the information they need. Producing things that are interesting but not useful. And then at its core, it's just this dilemma of not having the information you need. It's that core BI dilemma that we're trying to get after. And so one of the examples that really resonated me, and we'll make the slides available, I know it's hard to read here, was an actual email I got from a buyer at Target. And it was a few years ago. It was 2016. It was just after Thanksgiving, and Black Friday is a big shopping day in America. And we had done a lot of really cool new real-time, near real-time reporting that was available to people to understand how our sales going, who's getting up at 2 a.m. to buy the online deal that went online, who's standing in the stores on Thanksgiving instead of being with their families, all this data. And I got this email and I read through it, and it really hit me because it started hitting me, this emotional side, like all of what this buyer, who had the guts to actually email me, had been through. And so a lot of what I saw in this email were things like, I know this is small, right? And what she was writing about was that her Black Friday, she was in charge of storage and organization, so the big plastic bins that you put things away. And people usually need that the week after Christmas, right? Not on Thanksgiving, not before Christmas, but right afterwards. And so she was saying, hey, my Black Friday, my biggest day, is actually later. And she wanted to have the same kind of real-time reporting that was out there. And what I saw was just all this emotion coming through in her email. There was a fear that her work wasn't as important, right? I know my stuff is not important. I know I don't deserve, I'm part of that 99%, I don't deserve data, but you know what, if you can give me something, it's a willingness to settle for less, right? It's saying, I know I'm not important, if you could just give me half of what you gave everyone else, or half of what the big Black Friday stuff was there, it'll be okay. There was a need to develop a complex sort of business case and valuation and all these things. And this is a hard one because as someone I love data, I love numbers. So I want people to use data to justify their investment. But we run a risk of, if you always feel like you need to constantly justify it, that for some of the smaller things, you're not really going to do that. The need for senior executives to be involved, right? It's okay. I'll ask my vice president if you want me to. I can get her to send you an email and all these things, which again just gets down to this, like it's just, you could sense the emotional baggage that this person had, that they had been told constantly, your stuff is not important, that's going to take 6 months, I can't get it to you. And it's just this general sense of being glad to just be heard, right? And so if you think about all this emotional baggage, and the funny thing is this is someone who was actually brave enough to do something about it. How many other people had this emotional baggage, had this experience, and just stop asking, right? They wouldn't even email because they're like, you know what, I've never been listened to, and I'm just going to go. And so as I thought about where we were, and I thought about some of the emotion that was behind this email, I've thought back even a little bit farther for me in my own journey at Target, back to 2013, where I remember I was sort of thrown into the hot seat because some other people didn't want to go, where I had to go to the CEO and the COO and the chief merchandising officer, and I was asking for $2 million to pay for digital promotional data. And I remember standing there as a slightly younger middle manager, right? And I felt this. I felt like this is too much money. This doesn't seem like it should cost this much. I'm not even sure. I knew it might come back and the data might be wrong, that it might not really solve it. And it was just solving this tiny little one slice of a problem, right? Not everything I needed. And so I thought about that in 2013 and that experience for me emotionally. And then I thought about what we were able to do with Amy at that time in 2016, when really I was able to take that email and part of what I remember and said, hey, you know what? I get it. You don't need to give me a million, justifications. I don't need to hear from your vice president. One of my analysts could sit down in a couple hours and you can get the full real-time experience for your special event. And how did we get to a place where that kind of curiosity, that kind of initiative can be rewarded and empowered and enabled over and over again? And so what my hypothesis is, and we'll walk through a little bit, is part of what led us in 2013 to having to spend $2 million, to having people sending emails and feeling like they're never being heard and willing to settle for less and all those things, was very much what I would call an end-to-end approach to how we were trying to tackle the data problem and how we viewed getting data out into the organizations. So I picked a problem and I went after it, and we'll talk about what that means. So what I would argue is that what we need to do is end to almost end, right? Almost getting to the end, leaving the room for flexibility to empower lots of teams, leaving the room for someone to come in and say, hey, I sell storage bins, this is what's important to me, and not feeling like I have to go through this whole process. And so when I think about what I mean by end-to-end, and a little bit of what was happening in 2013, and a lot of this, it'll make sense, right? So I would say, hey, I have a whole bunch of problems, and we need to prioritize, right? We only have a certain amount of resources. That's always the case. And so I would say, you know what? I'm picking this number one problem. This is the one. And I feel good because I'm focusing on the most important thing. That's not a bad logic for a business. And then I would give it to some engineers or some data scientists. And I often worry, I love engineers. I just never have enough of them, right? And I'd wait a long time. And I'd hope, right? 6 months later, something maybe would come back. And if I was lucky, this business problem was solved. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe, we got half of it, we got some of it. But the problem is, in that 6 months, right, we still have these problems. Some of these original ones might have gone away, right? So some of these have gone away here. Hopefully, it wasn't the one I picked, right? Hopefully, 6 months later, I didn't just spend all this time and energy on something that went away. But also, new problems came up, right? And now I'm back in this same cycle where, okay, am I going to spend $2 million on the next problem and all these other pieces? And I think that's part of what got Amy to the place where she was, right? When she sent that email, it was living in this world where when you asked a question, even if it seemed simple, even if it seemed like it shouldn't take millions of dollars or times, because of how things were prioritized, because of the approach to the kinds of platforms we were building, it wasn't happening, or it wasn't happening quickly enough to actually keep up with the business. And so I would posit, why should we care, right? What I just described is not an illogical process. What I just described is we have lots of things to get done. We don't have a lot of resources. We have to pick what's most important. And so I think there's a number of reasons why we should care, and we'll unpack a few of those as well. So if I think about those little problems, and so I often like to talk about those problems on the right. To me, those are the orphaned business problems, right? They've been left alone. They have no parent, no sponsor. And even if the value there is small, if I add up those small little bits of value, I'm actually leaving a lot of value on the table for the organization. So purely from the perspective of, am I driving shareholder return? Am I doing what's best for my company? That was concerning. I think the second one is actually a bigger deal for me. And like I put data curiosity into my new title at DOMO. And I think if you want to build a culture of data curiosity, if you want to unlock data for this 99%, it is very dangerous to create a culture where people feel like they can't ask questions, right? So maybe some of their questions aren't the best, right? Maybe some of the things we said no to, we correctly said no to. But if we do it so much that people stop asking questions, that we quelch curiosity around data in our organizations, then we're going to be in trouble. A third place, which is a little bit unique to the BI and data space around this, is I think there's often a fallacy of self-service, right? And so we fool ourselves into saying we're going to solve this problem. It's this one set of data. It's these 5 metrics. And you're going to be able to query it using a tool, and you're done. And the reality is that people don't learn that way. People don't think that way. You can't expect that just because I'm done with something, that people don't need help and people don't need to tweak it. And so if you think about it as I'm solving one problem, I'm handing it over, and I'm just letting it sit there, it doesn't really work that way. You need to be engaging with people. You need to continue to teach them, to guide them, to do all those pieces. And I used to tell my team at Target that there's a fine line between self-service analytics and telling someone to go take a long walk after a short pier, right? I think you can't just say, hey, go do it. You need to help them. And so when we're overly focused on end-to-end, we get out of that. And then lastly, right, nothing is ever complete. We know this, right? I often tell our customers that I'm meeting with at DOMO now that the most important use case you can ever have for a product, for a project, is the one you don't know yet, right? Anyone can say, here are the 10 things we need to be able to do. What are we going to do? It's how do you build for flexibility? How do you build for what you don't know is going to come? Because we know that the business world is constantly changing. So digging into a couple of these concepts. So one is there's a great Harvard Business Review article earlier this fall about the business case for curiosity, which really resonated for me to the extent that, again, like I think there is business value just in creating an ecosystem that encourages curiosity, right? And so forget about data, forget about anything. We know if you encourage more curiosity in your organization, you have fewer decision-making errors, you have more innovation and positive change, both for creative and non-creative jobs. You have reduced group conflict. I have more open communication and better team performance. So again, if I'm doing something that's not helping to build up this curiosity, there's real, even though it feels a little squishy and soft, there's real business impact to that. The other concept, which is a little bit to these orphan business problems, comes from an agile coach of mine named David Hussman, who looked a little bit like the dude in The Big Lebowski, if people are film buffs. And so he had what he called was Dude's Law. And his equation for Dude's Law was that value is equal to Y divided by how. And I think the way this fits into the conversation is we often get very obsessed with that numerator, with the why, right? That's the, let me prioritize my top 10 things and say what they are. But the reality is if we could focus on that how, if we can build platforms that make the how easier and easier and easier and smaller, even when the why is small, my total value proposition is actually going up, right? And so that end-to-end thinking was very much on that numerator. And again, it felt right. It felt like the right thing to do. But you need to sort of balance those two. And I think this is a really good framework to see how you drive value in a different way. So what do we do, right? So we know end-to-end is not quite doing it. So I think people have tried other things, right? And they're not bad, right? So a lot of times I think you see end-to-engineer, right? So if you think about shared code base, Kubernetes, different kinds of engineering platforms that are out there, they do help maybe take, instead of one problem, I could take 10 or I could take 5. But again, it's relying on that engineering talent, which it's not that I don't love engineers, it's that I don't have enough of them, right? So if I'm just relying on platforms that need engineering skill, I'm only going to be able to get after a certain amount of problems. And then really the most famous one that I think everyone in this room probably deals with is end only, right? I'm just going to do it in Excel. I'm just going to do it in Access. I'm just going to do it in Google Sheets, whatever it is. And again, and some of this goes back to the emotion of Amy, right? It's not illegitimate. People just want to get the information they need. They just want to be able to use the data. And I think we should always honor the value of those things, right? And there is a ton of flexibility in just doing it in Excel, right? Now, there's a lot of downside too. There is scalability, there's the ability to collaborate, there's governance, there's redundancy of work, there's incorrect metrics, all those things. And so when I look at what I was able to do at Target, what we try to do at DOMO when we can, to me it's about this idea of end to almost end. And we actually were doing a Harvard Business School case at Target while we were doing this, and that's when this concept sort of popped in my head as I was talking to this Harvard professor was, you know what, this is what we're doing. What we're really talking about is how do I get it most of the way? How do I get it to a spot where I'm balancing not that end to end, but end to almost end? And so again, so what does end to almost end mean to me? It's that idea again of building it almost to the end, right? It's not about sacrificing the quality of the work. It's about getting it, instead of trying to aim all the way there, getting it just a little bit short and making it so that that last mile, right, that last 5 or 10% can happen incredibly close to the business. And sometimes that might mean the actual business user. Sometimes that might mean an analyst who's on my team who can sit with the business user. But it really is about how do I empower, how do I keep that flexibility in that last little bit? It's probably not even a mile. It's like 100 feet or something, right? I think the third thing, and I've mentioned this with the engineers, is it can get hard for engineering teams to hear this message. And I had debates with a lot of my engineering teams at Target where it becomes something about, okay, well, but you don't want me to talk to the business? You don't want me working on the most important problems? I shouldn't be thinking about how people are using what I develop? And so it's really not about that, right? It's the business problem, those list of problems, that always has to be the inspiration. We can't have technical work that happens in isolation from the rest of what's going on. But it's about thinking just one step back a little bit, right? How do I help the person that's maybe helping the business to do more? Because I know then I can actually solve way more problems when I'm taking that approach. And lastly, it's not about, right, and this gets to that end only piece, it's not about getting rid of engineering rigor. There are great things about the rigor that engineering brings to a business, whether it's automation, dependency tracking, error logging, backups, usage. All those things are important. And so we don't want to get rid of them, but I always thought about it as, how do I build platforms? How do I make my analysts and my business users, how do I inject engineering rigor into their lives, even though they're not engineers? How do I do things that let them track versions and track usage and track errors, but without needing to constantly go back to an engineer, because creating that bottleneck is what's bad. It's not engineering rigor isn't bad. It's just creating the bottleneck around resources and my ability to do that. So, and we're going to have a little bit of time for questions, but to sort of put a bow on it, I think the way that you really change your culture, the way that you really get that 99% to use data in a different and new way, is to take this end to almost end approach. And again, it's not a cookie cutter. It's not just the technology, right? This is how do I set up data platforms with an eye to how I drive change in the organization, and that's always going to be about the flexibility. And so certainly, I've not talked that much about DOMO, and that's not what this is for, but if you guys want to swing by booth 315, it's right over there. We certainly can talk to you a little bit about how this fits in. But otherwise, that's sort of it on my prepared content, and I'm happy to take some questions if we have a mic to go around. Thank you.
Ben, how do you prepare the people who already have a business job to close that last mile?
No, I think it's an excellent question. I think it's still, to the day I left Target, there were frustrations because it's not like all of a sudden they become like, oh, I get it, I'm supposed to interact, right? Like, well, no, they're used to either not being listened to or just being like sort of complaining and then waiting a while for things to come back. And so I think one of the things that worked well for me is I think you need to make them feel it and experience it, and it can't just be about a PowerPoint or an email or anything like that, right? And so one of my favorite examples that we did was we developed a new buyer dashboard, and we brought in 15 buyers to test it, and we gave them an hour and a half in the morning to play with it with very little instruction, just gut feeling. We had people recording what they did. After 90 minutes, we said, great, here are the 25 things we heard. We sent them away. We brought them back at 4 o'clock that day, and we said, okay, well, here's the 13 things we've already changed. And we walked them through it, and there was sort of like this light bulb going off in their head that, oh, if I ask, something can happen. There's flexibility here, but they needed to really experience it themselves. We can't think that having one training or just sending an email is not going to break through. So I really try to find ways, or with the buyer, Amy, right, that she actually saw she saw how this was valuable because she saw it right there in real life. I think just trying to do a training or do an email, like all those things are important, but until people really feel the difference, it's hard to get them to change. And that's a lot of, and there still were people when I left Target, I'd be like, God, why are you, like, something would come bubble up and bubble down, and I'm like, if you would have just asked, most of this could have been fixed, weeks ago. But that's part of how we have to do, the cultural change is just as important as any tool, for sure. Anyone else?
What would you say the first step is when you're creating a new data capability and you're looking for creating that culture of data curiosity? Is it most important to get people who have been living basically on instinct, driven by instinct, to take that step into data-driven decision making?
No, and it can't. Look, I mean, people love to manage on anecdote and manage on stories. So I think some of it is you have to create sort of a safe space for them to understand that, you still want their input, right? They still have value in what they're doing. I think for me, still the number one thing is scale, is getting data at a scale that is flexible enough to actually answer lots of different questions, right? Because again, like what's going to be useful for them is something new and different, right? So if I just take from tool A and recreate it in tool B without much different in scale or things like that, people are human. They don't want to change, right? So you have to give them more exciting, useful content. But again, it does take it takes a lot of time. And one of the things that we try to target, and sort of related to this idea of the orphan business problem, is we tried to sort of set up an urgent care for data. And one of the things that I think people feel, especially now when there's all this investment in data scientists and data engineering, a lot of times you get into this dynamic where they just want to work on the cool things. They don't want to work on the small things. And so the analogy I would use on the medical side is like if someone showed up with a cold and they went to the Mayo Clinic, which is in Minnesota where I went, one of the best hospitals where I live, one of the best hospitals in the world, they're probably going to say, oh, we're curing all these diseases. We have all these fancy doctors and all this fancy equipment. We don't want to deal with your cold, but you still need the urgent care clinic to help someone who has a cold. And so at Target, we tried setting up sort of an urgent care for data that sort of honored the fact that there's going to be some small questions. And the other really interesting thing we did with that is we actually made people do 2-week residencies in the urgent care clinic. So even if I was a data scientist curing cancer, I had to spend 2 weeks dealing and helping someone with smaller problems. And that actually made me a better data scientist because I spent time helping someone with a cold. The same way it might make you a better doctor if you spent some time volunteering at a clinic or whatever. So I think some of those things help. Again, giving that entry point for smaller problems is really important. Maybe one more. All right. Well, I'll be around at our booth as well if people have questions. And thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.